June has already seen some price cuts on the newest AMD and Nvidia GPUs. I just posted on my community page where I track deals this morning that the RX 7600 has dropped to $250 from its $270 launch price just a few weeks ago on Amazon. And the 4060 Ti, which launched at $399, is now down to $379.99 on B&H Photo. So we have seen some price cuts there, but a lot of people are going to be buying at an even lower price point than this. So let's say you wanted to buy under $200. Well, if I survey new prices at PC Part Picker, I'm not sponsored by them or anything, but they just survey a lot of new retailers, get us a good idea of what the general market looks like. The RX 6600 from AMD has dropped to $180, and at this price point, I think it's the only GPU I would recommend below $200 if you're buying new. The 6600 is quite competitive and even actually faster when you're not ray tracing against the RTX 3050, and the 3050 still costs more at $220. That's a $40 price gap, and the 6600's faster when you're not using ray tracing. We should probably talk about the differences between AMD and Nvidia here, but at this price point, the ray tracing advantage I think is not one that you should really take into account, just because the performance level is low enough here that I think you should be turning down settings rather than turning up ray tracing. So RX 6600 gets my under $200 recommendation. If you want to look into other options under $200 or just in general, this video is going to be focusing on new GPUs. Although there are a lot of great deals used right now, and also you should sell your used GPU to fund your next upgrade, and Jawa.gg is a great place to do that. This is today's sponsor. But for example, you can easily sell your gear here to fund your upgrade. They even sell, if you're just like, man, building my own PC is getting overwhelming, they sell completed systems, which is fantastic to see. And at certain price points in this video, I'm going to struggle to find a new GPU that I would recommend. Whereas used GPUs like the RTX 3080, let's see where their prices are. Nice thing here is we can sort prices low to high. So yeah, sorting prices low to high, looks like we can get, for $420, we could get an RTX 3080. And right now that crushes just about anything available in the new market at $400. So again, definitely, even though this video is focusing on new pricing, definitely look into Jawa.gg, check what's available used, and sell your old hardware here to fund the upgrade. Check the pinned comment and link in the video description. But let's get back to checking by price class in the new market. So the RTX 3050 costs $220 from Nvidia. There's nothing from the 40 series at this price point. But what are our competitors? I already showed you the 6600 is pretty competitive, but at a lower price. If you wanted to spend about the same money, you could look at the 6600 XT. The XT version is a different GPU and is significantly faster than the non-XT version that we looked at, and it's only $10 more than RTX 3050. And you could also look at this 6650 XT. Sometimes they're priced the same, but today it looks like that's up to $245. 6650 XT has slightly faster memory, but other than that is basically the same thing. So I would buy, if there's much of a price difference, I would get whichever of the two is cheaper. And then the other thing you can look into is, how about Intel? They have the A750 in roughly this price class, although it is up to $240. So in the $220 to $240 price point, we have the 3050, the A750, and the 6600 or 6650 XT from AMD. And between these, I would definitely recommend the 6600 XT from AMD if your use case is focused on gaming. I'll talk a little bit more about other things in a bit here. Intel's Arc drivers have gotten significantly better. Their software has gotten better. Their game support has gotten better, but it's still not as consistently up to par as AMD or Nvidia, especially if you went back and played older games. But even in new major releases, the Intel Arc architecture can be a bit inconsistent in its performance level. So generally, I think you're going to be getting better performance from the 6600 XT in most cases. The RTX 3050 from Nvidia gets beaten pretty handily if you're not just cranking ray tracing. But again, at this performance tier, I don't think cranking ray tracing makes a lot of sense, because instead I'd probably be turning down to medium or high settings rather than cranking past the ultra settings to using ray tracing just to get better performance. Maybe your personal preference is a bit different. Let's in general talk about Intel, AMD, and Nvidia here a little bit. Which one should you buy? What are the pros and cons at various, really at all price points? What are just the general differences? Well, in general, Nvidia just charges more for the same level of gaming performance, and can that be justified? Well, if one thing to think about is if you use your computer for more than just gaming, if you use it for work, then there are a lot of productivity apps, including AI-accelerated tasks that are programmed to run on Nvidia's CUDA core acceleration, and some apps still work very well on AMD and Intel, but if you had to pick a random app, it's more likely to be designed to run best on the market share leader, which is Nvidia. So, but take your professional workflow into account and research all of the apps that you use and what you do with them and how they run on the various GPU brands. If you want to consider not going with Nvidia for a professional workflow. In the gaming side of things, Nvidia's biggest advantage is ray tracing. However, at the lower performance levels, I don't think ray tracing makes a lot of sense to use. But at the higher performance levels, I think that could factor more into your purchasing decision for gaming. And the other main difference is image upscaling techniques. And DLSS is the best and is generally the widest supported. And when DLSS is not supported, but FSR is, or XeSS is, which is Intel's version of upscaling, those are both open to the other brands to use, whereas DLSS isn't. So I'm not saying I like the closed source approach, but it does mean that NVIDIA has access to all of those upscaling techniques, and their closed version is going to generate better image quality than the other two in almost all situations. However, that being said, FSR2 and XeSS are not always just hands down terrible looking compared to DLSS, but especially at lower resolutions or more aggressive settings, I think DLSS does have an image upscaling advantage, which can then get you a performance boost without too much of a hit to image quality. But again, at lower resolutions like 1080p, I would much rather just play at native resolution. But if I had to upscale, I do think DLSS does look better. Those are the main differences, but for straight up gaming, I think generally at this lower price point, I'm going to recommend the 6600 XT over these other two GPUs. And let's go ahead and move on to some other price points. If we want to jump up a little bit more money, I did mention at the beginning of the video that AMD's brand new 7600 has dropped to $250. And at least on one model at one retailer, but that's a good sign and that makes it a lot more compelling, and you might want to stretch your budget here over the 6600 XT up to $250 here, but that still leaves you at 8 gigabytes of VRAM. It does gain you the AV1 encoder, which I probably should have mentioned. That's one thing Intel had over the previous generation, like 3050 and 6600 XT, was an AV1 encoder. It doesn't help you with gaming, but if you're a streamer, especially to YouTube, which I think supports AV1 streaming, could be something to consider. And again, AMD's new 7600 will also get you that AV1 encoder. However, past this point, we could look into what's NVIDIA have available. Well, the 3060. Well, there is an 8 gigabyte version of the 3060 that I don't think you should buy, so just be careful. The 8 gigabyte version of the 3060 is $260. The 12 gigabyte version is only $278. It's not that big of a price increase for the extra major increase to 50% more VRAM, as well as it's not just more VRAM, the memory bus is cut down on the 8 gigabyte model, making it actually just slower in some situations, even when not spilling over the 8 gigabyte capacity. So I definitely recommend go with the 12 gigabyte version if you're buying a 3060. And again, that 12 gigabytes of VRAM is really nice and does give it some reason to buy over the 7600, even drop down to its $250 price point. Basically here, the 3060, you might use some ray tracing, which can give it an advantage over the 7600. Again, it costs a bit more, has 12 gigabytes more VRAM than the 7600. So because the 3060 12 gigabyte has come down so far in price, it's suddenly not just a complete, just definitely get the AMD card recommendation at this price point. Although when you're not using ray tracing or upscaling and not spilling over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, the 7600 can give you more performance in a rasterized workload. However, here's my real problem with the 3060 12 gigabyte if you did want to go here, is just that the 6700 XT version which is also a 12 gigabyte card, cost $310. Now I know that is more money, but I really want to say that basically if you're going over the $220 to $230 price point, it might almost make sense just to stay at that point until you can afford $310 and get yourself a 6700 XT. Because the 6700 XT has the same 12 gigabytes of VRAM you're getting off your 3060, but is significantly faster when not ray tracing, and actually can match it or beat it in lighter ray tracing workloads because it comes from such an advantaged baseline position. And then it's only in the heaviest of ray tracing workloads where that 3060, might pay off, but then are you losing enough performance that you don't want to use the ray tracing anyway, right? We run into that kind of a deal. We also have the 6700 non-XT from AMD, which is a 10 gigabyte graphics card coming in at $280, so basically the same price as the 3060 12 gigabyte. But again, this now has less VRAM than the 12 gigabyte 3060. It costs about the same. And again, Nvidia does have some of those advantages in upscaling and ray tracing, and 3060 ray tracing at 1080p, depending on how demanding it is, can be somewhat usable. So really, I've got to say that my next GPU that I think just stands out from the crowd from a value proposition is the 6700 XT. So basically, I try to get up to this price point and buy the 6700 XT. Now, some people might be like, well, what about the 3060 Ti? The 3060 Ti is the closest performance competitor to the 6700 XT, but from Nvidia, it does cost more. It's still $333, although it has come down significantly from its $400 price point since we finally had the 4060 Ti replace it. Which does put it more competitive with the 6700 XT than it used to be, but it's still an 8 gigabyte VRAM card, and that's the main thing going against it, beside the fact that it does just cost more than the 6700 XT. When it's not constrained by its VRAM and you're not ray tracing, it does perform a lot like the 6700 XT, but more and more games are starting to spill over the 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and granted, you can turn settings down to get that back under control, but that's going to be annoying to do, and the 6700 XT doesn't have that issue. However, the ray tracing and upscaling on the 3060 Ti are better than what you get from AMD. But for my money, I would go with the 6700 XT at this price point because, first of all, it is less money, and second of all, that at 50% more VRAM here does pay off in some of the latest games, and I would expect that to become more common, not less common, over time. But I'm not going to say you'd be absolutely crazy to buy the 3060 Ti as long as you understand the 8 gigabytes of VRAM will mean that you have to tweak settings in some of the latest releases, even at 1080p, in order to not have that be causing you some issues. And it's not every game, but I think the amount of games where that's an issue will go up over time, not down. Intel does offer the A770 with a 16 gigabyte model at about $340, but the 6700 XT is generally better for less money. Sure, it's 12 gigabytes instead of 16, but at this performance tier, you don't really need the 16, 12's plenty. And definitely don't try to save money and get the 8 gigabyte A770 for $310. Again, that's the same price as a 6700 XT, which just outperforms it. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't recommend the Intel A770 here either. The 6700 XT is just faster. Okay, now it's past this point that it starts to become really hard to recommend any new GPUs. The 6750 XT is a little better than the 6700 XT, but it's $360. I don't think spending $50 more on that makes a lot of sense. The 3070 is still up around $400 new if you're looking for them new. The 3070 Ti doesn't make any sense when it costs about as much as 6800 XT. Okay, you have the new 4060 Ti from Nvidia, which, it dropped its price $20, $380. The main problem with this card is that it has 8 gigabytes of VRAM. And, it was disappointing at $400. It's a little less disappointing at $380. But it's not much faster than a 3060 Ti. Its main difference is it has the AV1 encoding, frame generation. Frame generation is nice. But I've talked about frame generation a lot in other videos. So I'm not going to go too into depth here. It's a nice to have but situational feature. It's useful in single player games. Once you can get a baseline frame rate of 50 or 60 FPS, I think it works pretty well to boost you to take advantage of a higher refresh rate monitor. But it does slightly increase latency, and it does have some impact to visual quality, especially HUD elements don't always track super well, things like that. But it is a nice to have feature in single player games, and more often than not, I would turn it on when it's available in a single player game, and I'm already at a base frame rate of around 60 FPS. That being said, $380 versus a 6700 XT at $310. It's not much. I mean, the thing is, the 6700 XT, again, it's $310 versus $380. It doesn't have frame generation, but it has 50% more VRAM and almost as good of performance when you're not ray tracing. I don't know, guys. The thing about the 4060 Ti, though, is if you are set on buying Nvidia and you do have a $400 budget, there's not a lot else to recommend here other than, like I said, going over to someplace like Jawa.gg, like I mentioned, getting like a used 3080 for a little over $400. Something like that might make sense. But the 4060 Ti itself, if the 6800 from AMD cost around $400, it would be an obvious recommendation over it. But right now, 6800 non-XT versions, they seem to be drying up. There's not a lot available anymore. So they're costing as much as their XT counterpart, which pushes me to the $500 recommendation. At $500, there's really nothing that competes well with the 6800 XT. It's significantly better than Nvidia's like 3070 Ti, which has half the VRAM at 8 gigabytes and costs about the same. And the 3070 is right up there as well. I really just wish there was more in the $400 to $500 price point right now. But basically, if you have to buy a $400 GPU right now, I do think the 4060 Ti is the best one available. It's just a shame its VRAM is 8 gigabytes, and it has dropped to 380, but you might want to consider just saving almost $100 and buying a 6700 XT instead. Anyway, if we go up to the $500 price point, the 6800 XT costs $500, has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, and doesn't really have anything competing with it from the current generation, and it's a lot better than the 3070 Ti at the same price point, especially with current VRAM situations in current games, in my opinion. So the 6800 XT gets my $500 price point recommendation. If you're going up to $600, things get a little more interesting again. At $600, well, it looks like drop down to $590 on the cheapest model, but most are still $600. The 4070 from Nvidia has 12 gigabytes of VRAM, which is not causing issues at 1080p or 1440p right now in any situations, at least in my testing. However, there are some games pushing right up against 12 gigabytes of VRAM, so that's a bit of a con. If you're only keeping this for a couple of years, I think it's not likely to be too big of an issue, even at 1440p. And I don't think this GPU really has the horsepower to be a great 4K GPU, and if you were using it at 4K, you'd probably be turning down settings a lot anyway and using a lot of DLSS. So anyway, I don't like that it's only 12 gigabytes for a $600 graphics card. It performs in rasterized performance a lot like the 6800 XT, which costs $100 less. So you might want to consider just getting the 6800 XT, which has more VRAM and costs $100 less. However, that being said, if you are using ray tracing and the 4070 is strong enough to use ray tracing, then the 4070 does have a significant advantage over the 6800 XT. It's also the newer architecture, so it has AV1 encoding. It's a lot more energy efficient, and it has frame generation, which, like I said, is a nice to have, but situational feature. So at $600, the 4070 is really competing against the 6950 XT from AMD. And here's the thing, the 6950 XT does cost about the same. It's a little more expensive, models around $610 to $620. However, the 6950 XT, while it does have a bit more VRAM and a bit more rasterized performance, it still loses in ray tracing performance to the 4070, especially when you're using heavy ray tracing workloads. DLSS upscaling is better than FSR upscaling, and the 4070 does have frame generation. But besides all of that, there's a good chance the 6950 XT will not fit in your case or will not be supported by your power supply. That is something that you really do need to consider if you're upgrading to the 6950 XT. So that might just rule it out as an option for a lot of people. The 6950 XT cards are generally very big and very power hungry. So for that in mind, I think for a lot of people, the 4070 will make the most sense. Easier to run on your power supply, easier to fit in your case, has a lot of newer features with AV1 encoding, frame generation, a better upscaler, all of that. But I should mention the 6950 XT does get you a bit more non-ray tracing performance for a similar price, and the 6800 XT gets you about the same non-ray tracing performance for almost $100 less. However, if I was buying a GPU at $600 right now, I would probably go with the 4070 for the energy efficiency fitting in the case, runs a lot cooler, newer features, all of that. I just wish it had more VRAM and cost $100 less. And I'm not saying you'd be wrong to get the 6800 XT or the 6950 XT instead for the extra VRAM and either saving money or getting a bit more performance when not ray tracing. So all of those can make sense. I'd probably go with the 4070 myself, but I really just would rather wait for it to hopefully come down $100, but whatever. Anyway. How about the next price point up? The next GPU in Nvidia's lineup would be the 4070 Ti, which comes in at $800. At $800, its main competitor is the 7900 XT, not XTX, which we have some models. I've seen them drop as low as about $750. It looks like right now they're at about $780. The 7900 XTX gives you 20 gigabytes of VRAM instead of 12. So if you're considering playing at 4K resolution, that might really be something to consider. Also, if you're going to hang on to your GPU for a long time, having that extra VRAM might be nice. Again, the 4070 Ti is only at a 12 gigabyte card, which again, right now at resolutions up to 1440p is fine. At 4K, it's usually fine, but we're starting to see some issues there at times. Again, this is kind of going to come down to a features over raw performance calculation for you. These cost about the same. The 7900 XT is a bit faster when you're not ray tracing. When you're using heavier ray tracing workloads, the 4070 Ti is faster, has better upscaler, has frame generation, more power efficient. So again, I'm going to give this a split recommendation. At this price point, 12 gigabytes of VRAM for $800 just really does feel bad, and 20 gigabytes feels a lot better. If you're not planning on hanging on to your GPU for a long time, though, if you upgrade pretty frequently, I don't think 12 gigabytes is going to give you a lot of problems. If you're hanging on to the GPU a longer time, I think then the 20 gigabytes might start to pay off. I'm going to give a split recommendation here. Just be aware of the pros and cons of both GPUs and buy the one that makes the most sense to you. I think if you're going to be using ray tracing, which at this performance level at 1440p or even 1080p, the 4070 Ti does have a lot of ray tracing potential here, especially when combined with upscaling, where DLSS does have an advantage. So I do think there's a compelling argument for both GPUs here. Now, the next price class up would be the 7900 XTX. The Extra X pushes the price up to $960, but also does get you a lot more performance and 4 gigabytes more VRAM compared to the non-XTX model, just the XT model. So we're up to 24 gigabytes of VRAM, some more performance. This is the best GPU at around $1,000. It's $950. Now, if you start comparing it to the 4080, keep in mind that the 4080 does cost more. The 4080 is around $1,100. At MSRP was $1,200, but it's come down a bit. So basically, there's a $150 price gap here. Between the two GPUs, I would rather have the 4080. It has 16 gigabytes of VRAM instead of 24, but I don't think 16 gigabytes of VRAM is anything to be too concerned about right now, especially at 1440p. At 4K resolution, maybe it'll cause some issues eventually, but honestly, at 4K resolution, even on a card as powerful as the 4080, you're likely to be wanting to use DLSS quality a lot of the time, which does rein in a bit of the VRAM, things like that. In other words, I'm not too concerned about 16 gigabytes of VRAM myself. in the real near future. So I don't think the extra VRAM on the XTX is that big of a selling point. They have very similar non-ray tracing performance. The 7900 XTX can be a bit faster, but not in a meaningfully different way. Whereas when you're enabling heavy ray tracing workloads, the 4080 is faster in a meaningfully different way. Where it's giving you a very different experience. When you combine that with the better upscaling, and then with the availability of frame generation, and because the 4080 can usually easily get you a baseline frame rate of 60 FPS or more, where I feel like then frame generation does become very usable and a compelling feature in certain single-player games. I think with all of those things in mind, I would definitely recommend the 4080 over the 7900 XTX personally. However, if you can't go past the $1,000 mark, then in other words, the 7900 XTX gets my best GPU at $950 recommendation, and the 4080 gets my best GPU at $1,100 recommendation. And if they cost the same, I would pick the 4080. It's up to you whether it's worth spending the extra $150, which at this price point might not be as big of a deal, to get all of those extra features and ray tracing performance. And you lose a bit of VRAM, but you still get 16, which I do think is still a pretty good number. Now, past this point, there's only the 4090. The 4090 is by far just the most powerful GPU on the market. If you're playing at 4K resolution and a 4090 is something you can afford responsibly, it's absolutely the best 4K GPU. That extra performance is noticeable. It also has 24 gigabytes of VRAM, so you shouldn't ever run into issues with that. But man, having a 4090 to be able to do, a 4K resolution, especially if you click on DLSS quality and frame generation in some titles, you can get some massive performance. Anyway, I can highly recommend the 4090 if you can afford $1,600 GPU responsibly. The vast majority of people can't, and if you can, you probably already bought one. So anyway, that's enough to say about that. Now, what will we be seeing upcoming in the near future? In the near future, we will be seeing the RTX 4060. It's been announced as a July release date at $299. It's going to be an 8 gigabytes graphics card. And it's, right now all we have to go off of is Nvidia's performance claims. Nvidia's performance claims claim it's going to be about 1.2 times the performance of the RTX 3060, which if they mean the 12 gigabyte version, and they did show it against the 12 gigabyte version in their slides when they're talking about the specs, but then didn't exactly specify in the performance claim. But if that's 20% faster than the 3060, coming in at $299, it will at least be more interesting than a lot of what we've seen from this generation. It will still only have 8 gigabytes of VRAM at the $300 price point. I'm less concerned about that. But in general, I would say that if you are buying in that $300 price point, it might make sense to at least wait until early July when we get the reviews of the 4060 and also see what it might do to shake up that price point. Could it push the 3060 down even further? I actually don't think it will, just because it's not that much faster, and the 3060 does offer more VRAM, and we'll have to see how these performance claims actually pan out. But anyway, just be aware that the 4060 could do something to shake up the $300-ish price point in the near future, so it might make sense to wait for that before you do buy. However, the 6700 XT is going to still be faster, and I did recommend that as my $300 GPU, and it will have more VRAM and all that. So, all right, I hope this was useful for you guys. Huge thank you to channel subscribers, channel members who hit the join button to financially support the channel. That is just unbelievable. You are beautiful people, and I hope everyone has an excellent day.